Hey everyone, welcome to our second ever Creating in Fortnite live stream. Today I'm joined with my co-host Heather Storm, along with our two verse wizards, Capen and Evan. These two are going to be leading us through some demos today, but I'll let everyone introduce themselves. Heather, why don't you start?
Yeah, sure. I'm Heather Storm. I'm a creator evangelist manager here at Epic for Fortnite and UEFN. Been here for a little over a year and a half now, and super excited to talk about Verse today because it's what I've been learning for the last 4 weeks. So hoping to get a lot of tips and tricks as Capen and Evan walk us through things, but we'll hand it over to them.
Okay. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Cape and Rue. I'm a programmer writer at Epic, specifically on the verse documentation team, and I've been here for about 8 months. Um, Programmer writer is a weird title. It just means that we write verse and we write about verse is the shortest way I describe it. So, yeah, I'll pass it over to Evan.
Hey everyone, Evan Brown. I'm a programmer writer intern. Been here since January, working on the same team as Capen. Like you said, it is a weird title. And I've been learning verse pretty much with everyone else in the community as it's been deployed. So it's been a really cool time.
Awesome. And I'm Josh. I'm a creator evangelist. I've been here for 2 years now. So without further ado, we're going to be diving into verse today. We'll be touching on how to get started, diving into some technical examples, and then doing some Q&A with the chat. So, Capen, you want to get started for us?
Yeah. Yeah. We can cut over to my screen now and I'll show everybody around. Cool. So, our team likes to say that we make games and show people how we made them. And we're going to do that today. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about Verse and the documentation for it. So, many of you watching may know about Fortnite's creative mode. But right now, if you want to do something that no existing device or combination of devices can do, you can't implement that idea in creative. And that's where Verse comes in. Verse is a new programming language from Epic. You can expand the creative toolset by using programming to fill the gaps that devices can't right now. And you can make your own devices in Verse to add new functionality or simplify some complex device setups that you might have had in creative. So, first things first, I'm going to show you where the documentation for Verse lives. So, as you can see here, I'm at dev.epicgames.com. You can start there. And once you get to the home page, scroll all the way down to the Epic Games dev community. That's going to open up our community site and it's going to default you to Unreal Engine. I'm just going to click over here to UEFN and Creative. And then finally, on the left sidebar here, you can see the Unreal Editor for Fortnite documentation. So here we are. This is UEFN and Verse documentation combined. Right now, Verse only runs in UEFN, so the documentation lives together. So, how do you get started? Not surprisingly, we would recommend you get started on Get Started. So I'm going to click that on the left sidebar here, and you can see here we have two onboarding guides, one for UEFN and one specifically for Verse. So I'm going to click that, the Verse Programming Onboarding Guide, and we'll let that load. And so this page is going to take you through a series of steps to kind of get you up and running with Verse. Our first step, which I won't show here, but I really recommend you watch, is a super cool video about learning to think like a programmer using, the idea of a recipe that you would make a pizza with to teach you to kind of think in the way programmers think. So once you've watched that, you should definitely start with modify and run your first verse program. We recommend everyone starts here. It should be, the first thing everybody does when they want to when they want to use verse in UEFN. So I'm going to click into that. Once I get here, modify and run your first verse program is going to show you how to do a few things. It's going to teach you how to create a project with our verse devices starter example, which is in our feature examples when you open UEFN. It's going to show you how to put a verse device on your island. Verse devices are basically kind of the container for verse code in UEFN. You can actually see here where, someone's dragging a verse device into their island. It's also going to show you how to make changes to your verse code and then push those changes to a currently running playtest session. So it's really cool that you can, start a playtest session, change verse code, click push verse changes, and then you with that changed verse code pretty quickly. And finally, it's going to teach you some basic debugging tips, and you need that for learning any programming language. It's a huge help. So definitely check modify and run your first verse program first. So after that, I'm going to go back to verse programming onboarding, and you have two steps after that. And really, we think about these as kind of as you can follow. If you are someone who has never programmed before and you've heard about verse, but you want to learn more about it before you jump into making a game with it, definitely learn the basics of writing code in verse. So that's going to teach you things like key terms. It's going to teach you the sort of foundations of a lot of programming languages, things like variables, conditional expressions, and functions. And it'll actually take you all the way up to writing code that affects the game. So you're not writing just code in abstract. You are a few lessons in. You're writing code that, for example, will heal or hurt your Fortnite player, your Fortnite character. So
One
we
thing
really,
I just did
yeah.
this
Go ahead.
myself, like, 3 weeks ago, and I've been a programmer for, what, like, 15 years? This was still super helpful because the definitions that we use for specific things are a little bit different than you might be used to if you're coming from other programming languages like C++ or C#, but are more similar to things that you might have interacted with in, like, Python or Lua. So, definitely, even if you have programmed before, I still recommend going through step 3. It's pretty quickly to go through all the steps, but I just wanna put that out there that it's pretty fast and easy, regardless of if you know code or not.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great point. I think it's good. It's good for people who've never programmed, but it's also good for people who know how certain programming languages works and want to just understand, okay, what's the verse version of that? How does verse do that thing? So that's a great point. So definitely jump into those. After that, or if you just want to jump right into making a game, if you're thinking, okay, I know verse can do these extra things. I want to know how to see what it can do. Then you go to step 4, learning to use verse in UEFN. And there we have a tutorial here called create your own device using verse. And what that does, it's a little bit like modify and run your first verse program, but it's actually going to show you how to create a new verse file in UEFN and build that code and then get you a brand new device that you can drag into your level. So after you've gone through that, the real thing I want to show you at the bottom here are these next steps, which show you kind of some more detailed, um, more intermediate verse stuff in UEFN. And then you also get these tutorials. So this is a list of all the tutorials that have verse code in them on our doc site. So some of the games that we have tutorials for on the EDC show game tutorials that don't use verse. These are all the ones that do, and you can think about that in two categories. We have it divided up into learn game mechanics or build a game. The game mechanic tutorials are things that will show you how to implement um, certain mechanics, certain things that your players will do in the game and can be adapted to multiple different kinds of games. The full game tutorials are exactly what they sound like. We'll walk you step by step to make a whole game and using verse code. Evan's going to show one of those later. So I'm going to stick with a game mechanic tutorial here to show you what these tutorials look like. So I'm going to pick synchronized disappearing platforms. So synchronized disappearing platforms is it's going to show you how in verse you create platforms that disappear and reappear. Kind of try to show you how to implement some interesting gameplay in something like an obstacle course. And what I want to point out is these two sections, which are verse language features used and verse APIs used. These should be in pretty much all of our verse tutorials, these two sections. The verse language features used is going to show you, okay, what are the really basic native things about verse that you're going to learn about in this tutorial. In this case, you have things like arrays, which is how you store data, loops, things that you might recognize from other programming languages. So that's the first section. The second section are the verse APIs used. API stands for Application Programming Interface. And basically, in this case, it's how Verse talks to UEFN. It's how Verse can get information from UEFN and maybe more importantly, how it can control things in UEFN. And you'll see in this one, for example, you'll learn about sleep and you'll learn about editable properties. So back to the API. The API has a reference in our documentation. I'm going to scroll all the way down here. And once you feel like you have your feet under you with First, once you've gone through a few tutorials and learned some stuff, you're probably going to start wondering, what else can I do with First in UEFN? And the API reference is where you want to go. API references are common things across software development. Again, it's how a programming language, how code can talk to a piece of software. And so in the Verse API reference, you have these three modules. You have the Fortnite module, you have Unreal Engine module, and the Verse module. The Verse one is going to be the really basic stuff. It's going to, just show you details about things like arrays, things like multiplication, the basic functionality of the language. Unreal Engine is going to show you stuff that functionality that the devs have pulled over from Unreal Engine to let you use in UEFN. So things like 3D math, stuff like that you might need to use in a game. And then the Fortnite module is going to be stuff that you will probably recognize if you played Battle Royale or Creative. So the Fortnite module has all these different sections. I'm just going to dip into one to show you what you can expect. So I'm going to pick the characters module. The characters module has classes and structs and interfaces. I'm going to focus on just the interfaces here and specifically on Fort character. And with each of these API sections, you get a description of what the API does or what the data type or the function does, in this case, an interface. And I'm going to click into Fort character. So this says it's the
Can
main.
you briefly describe what an interface is before we click into Fort character? I know a lot of people
Oh,
haven't worked with classes, structs, or interfaces before.
great. Yeah, great question. So an interface is you can think of it as, it's a little bit like a class, but it's sort of a contract that you make that says, okay, if you want to define a class based off of this interface, um, you must fulfill all the requirements that I've laid out in this interface. So it might be that it has to have certain variables associated with it. It might be that it has certain functions that you need to implement, but it's saying something like, I've defined this interface, if I've got, an animal, something like that as an example. I've got my animal interface. I say, the animal has legs and how tall it is, what it eats, like defining all these pieces of data, and then saying, if you want to make something based on that interface, like a dog or a cat, then you have to follow the rules that I set in this interface, but you can make subtypes from that. So it's kind of a loose contract that you make to define in your code.
Great. So
So
let's talk about the
yeah,
Fort character one then.
cool, perfect. So the Fort character is the main MPI, main API implemented by Fortnite characters, which basically just means this is the object that represents things, your Fortnite character player in Fortnite. So if you have a player character in Fortnite, your regular person that you run around as, that's what this interface is referring to. So when I go into this page, you can see all the the things that it can do, more or less. So exposed interfaces, it's going to say this interface exposes the following interfaces, which is a little bit confusing. But basically, what that means is when you go through all this, you can click into each one of these and see that because this interface exposes each of these other ones, you know that it implements the same functionality that these interfaces require you to implement. And so in this example, what that means is that a fork character exposes the damageable interface. So I'll click into here and I'll see that the damageable interface has these functions, damage and damaged event. There's two different types of damage functions, but basically it means that you can call the damage function on a fork character, which will do exactly what it sounds like. It'll damage your character. And you also have the damaged event, which signals when that character is damaged. So you can basically listen to that event and then do something when you know that that character has been damaged.
That's got to be
So
really
that's how you,
useful.
yeah, yeah, and it shows, it gives you this full list, and you can feel confident that when it has this list associated with it, that your interface is going to be able to do these things.
Awesome.
So past exposed interfaces, we also have functions, and these are the things that are just specific to Fort character. And so you have all these cool things like you get view location, which is will return in code where the character is looking. You can subscribe to things like is the character crouched? Are they down but not out? Are they currently in the air? Are they in the water? So you can get all this information and build gameplay off of that. There's a couple of cool other things down here where you can show or hide the character, make them visible or invisible, and make them vulnerable or invulnerable. So I would definitely encourage anyone that is curious about, what can be done in the API to find this reference and dig into it. And if you see something in here that's not working the way you expect, or you don't think is working at all, definitely post in the forums. We're reading. Our team reads the forum. First Devs reads the forum. We have a lot of people in there looking all the time. So definitely post anything that you see, and we'll get a response when we can. Um, and we know that people are always looking here to see if we're adding new things, and the answer is yes, we are all the time. Um, so just know that we definitely hear you on that. But the capabilities will definitely expand over time. And I think that's everything I have. If we've got questions about documentation, I can take those. But otherwise, I'll throw back to Josh.
Awesome. Thank you, Capen. If anyone has any questions about the documentation and that API list, quickly throw those in. Otherwise, we'll move on.
Yeah, let's give everybody just like 1 second. I know we can give some quick shout outs to a couple people who are in chat. I know Maestro and a couple of other people are asking some forward looking questions. We're not going to be able to answer those today, but I am taking note of every single question that you write down so that when we are able to, we can answer those. So definitely keep those coming. If there's anything else coming in, let us know. But I'm not seeing anything else, Josh.
Great. Okay, well, Evan, why don't you take us over, and if any questions flow in, we'll get to them at some point.
No, at the
Yeah, I
end.
got
We've
you.
we've got time.
At the end
Yeah,
or
we got time.
during, wherever we find time, yeah.
All right, if you want to swap the screen back over to me. All right, so I really want to just go over one of our tutorials to try and serve as a good example of what you can learn um, and what cool language features you can learn from all the cool documentation we've written. So we've seen a lot of like really, really cool projects people have made, and increasingly we're seeing people utilize the Verse API in really new and cool ways, like taking full advantage of all the language features. And we think that a lot of the build a game tutorials and learn game mechanics tutorials that we've made serve as a good entry point to learning those language features. So I just wanted to go over the Team Elimination game tutorial for you today, walk through some of the key parts step by step, and highlight some of the important language things that you can learn when you go through it yourself. So back up for a second. What is Team Elimination game? You, as players, have probably played a game mode very similar to this, where you score an elimination, you progress to the next weapon, you advance through a series of weapons, and then when you get past the final one, you win the game. Team Elimination game puts a bit of a spin on the traditional version, where players advance through a series of weapons as a team. If you are at or equal to the highest weapon tier on your team, instead of promoting yourself, you will promote a player who is at a lower weapon tier. But if you're equal to everyone, then you'll promote yourself. This means that your whole team advances through weapons in a bit of a ladder fashion, and it allows more skilled players to really help carry their team, get players who might be stuck on more difficult to use weapons up, and yeah, that's basically the main function of it. So, why this tutorial? Well, it covers two important language features that I really want to highlight, which are maps and subscribable events. Like Capin mentioned before, you can always tell what language features and APIs are used in a tutorial by looking at the language features used and APIs section. For instance, here we cover maps, type aliasing, which I'll get to later, options, arrays, for loops, if statements, failure contexts, subscribable events, the play space API, and the Teams API. I think this is probably a pretty good starter tutorial if you want to get, really into learning verse. So I'll kind of just jump right into it. We'll be jumping right over to UEFN. So here's our level. Do a little fly through. This is the level we have set up for our game mode. And here are all the devices that we'll be going over. So if you want to follow along with this tutorial on the Team Elimination game page, I'll be mainly covering steps 3, 4, 5, and 7 in this one. And we'll be starting out with step 3, which is subscribing to player events. But back to UEFN. So I have all my player spawn pads. Here's the array of weapons that the players will be progressing through. Here are 2 sentry devices, which we'll get to later. An endgame device to end the game once a player advances past the final weapon, and then our verse authored device, which contains all of our verse code. And we'll be jumping into VS Code to look at that in a second. But for the main thing we want to do right now, to even start playing this Team Elimination game, a player needs to spawn, and we need to give them a weapon. So let's jump into VS Code. Here's our file. There's going to be a lot, but I will explain it piece by piece, line by line. So don't get too worried.
Wait, hold on. Before we jump in, can you show me how you got here? Like, if I was in the editor,
Yes.
how did you get here?
So in the content browser, if you've already made your creative device, you can go to the creative devices folder and just double click on your file. If not, you can open the Verse Explorer, right click and hit add new verse files to project, type in your name, and that'll open a VS Code instance with your verse author device.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So if I want to start from scratch, I can do it that way, but we've already got a device placed.
Yes, that's correct.
Perfect. Okay, thanks.
So back to VS Code. At the top, we'll get to this later, but at the top, I have a bunch of editables that correspond to my devices in the level. Here's my endgame device, our array of weapon granters, our array of player spawners, our array of sentries, the number of eliminations to end the game. This will be set to the length of the weapon granters array so that when a player advances past the final weapon, we can end the game. An array for the 2 teams in this game mode, and this team map variable, which we'll get to later. For now, we're just going to focus on the main thing of when a player spawns, we need to grant them the first weapon. So in onBegin, which is our entry point into the code, it's the first thing that runs. All we're doing is we're setting our teams array using the play space get team collection get teams that populates it with both of our teams. We're saying the number of eliminations to end the game to the length of the weapon branches array. This other function, populate teams and players, which sets up our team map. We will get to that later. And then in this for loop, we're subscribing player spawners to this onPlayer spawn function. Well, what does that really mean? So player subscriptions, you might have messed with them before, or rather, sorry, subscriptions in general, you might have messed with them before, but to subscribe a function to something means that that function will be run when that event is signaled. If you mouse over this player spawner spawned event, you can see that it is of type listenable, and it returns an agent. So when a player spawns on a spawn pad, this spawn event is triggered. If we subscribe this onPlayer spawn function to it, this spawn event will send the agent that just spawned to this onPlayer spawn function. Subscribable events are really, really important. Capen already covered it in some detail. For instance, damaged event, you can have an event trigger whenever a character gets damaged. Here, whenever a player gets spawned, whenever a player gets eliminated. They are important for a really wide variety of devices across Fortnite. And if you're having a hard time visualizing them, if you've come from creative, they're very analogous to direct event binding. So when a device triggers an event and another device is listening to that, waiting for like on trigger or something, it's pretty much the same deal.
Okay, that makes sense.
So in our for loop, we have to do this for each player spawner. We're subscribing this onPlayer spawn function, and we'll go look at that right now. Like I said, again, when a player spawns, we need to grant them a weapon. We're actually going to split this up into two functions. Our onPlayer spawn function is going to call another function, grant weapon, that we'll get to in a moment. It is important to split up responsibility in your code like this. There might be multiple instances where a player wants to be granted a weapon, but not necessarily multiple instances where a player spawns. So it's helpful to split out the weapon granting functionality from our player spawning functionality. So back to onPlayer spawn. It takes a agent, we name it inPlayer, we get the team for that player, we get the weapon tier for that player. For the moment, we're just going to set this to 0 to correspond to the first index in the weapon granters array. And then we call grant weapon with our player and the weapon tier. Grant weapon will actually do the functionality of giving the player a weapon. And that's just down here. So grant weapon is another function that takes a optional agent. An option is just a container that says there is probably a item of this type in here. So for instance, a optional agent means there's either an agent here or it's false. The reason you want to use it is there might be situations where you can't guarantee that you're passing that particular value to a function, and this just allows for type safety. So it takes an optional agent and the tier of the weapon that we want to grant that agent. In our failable context, our if statement here, we get the appropriate item granter from the weapon granters array, get the player we're going to grant the item to by accessing the option using this question mark syntax, and then we're just calling item granter.grant item on the granted player. And that's
So
basically it.
basically, we're giving an item, which is a weapon, to the player that's currently in this loop.
Correct.
Great.
For every player that spawns, their spawned event will trigger. The player spawner will pass the agent who spawned to onPlayer spawn. OnPlayer spawn will call grant weapon and pass the weapon tier of the player that we want to grant the weapon to. And then grant weapon will grant them the weapon from the appropriate item granter.
Okay.
I know that's a lot. So we're going to actually jump in game to show you that this works. We already have our session running, and thankfully, we don't have to do a full push of all our changes since all we're doing is changing verse code. We're going to go up here to verse, build verse code, and then push our verse changes. And if we hop into Fortnite, we should start the game. And as you can see, we spawn with the first weapon in the weapon granter's array, which is this combat pistol. All right, cool. But this isn't really a game mode. All we can do is spawn with a pistol. I can shoot at Capen a few times. I can eliminate him, and I don't go to the next weapon. Oh, we're going to end the game. We're going to hop back out, and we're going to fill out the functionality for actually granting a player a weapon and how we're keeping track of that. If you're following along in the tutorial, this is steps 4 and 5. So, back in Visual Studio Code, it's helpful to back up a moment and think about the logic of what we're trying to do. When a player scores an elimination, we need to grant them the next weapon based on 2 rules. If they're at a equal tier to everyone else on their team or a lower tier, we need to promote them. If they're at a higher weapon tier than any other player on their team, we need to promote that teammate instead. So how are we going to keep track of this? Well, we could have an array of players on each team and then go through the array and try and find a player, get their weapon tier. This is possible. You can write it this way, but it's a little slow. So instead, we're going to be making use of maps. And that'll be right here at the top. So what are maps? Maps are a container type that provides really handy key value associations between objects. They're flexible, they're useful, and they're fast. So what are keys and values? So a map takes a key and it gives you a value based on that key. If I have a map of players to weapon tiers and I give the map a player, it will give me back the weapon tier for that player. I don't have to iterate through the map to find a particular player. I can just give it the player and instantly get back the weapon tier. So it's a much faster system than actually having to just iterate through arrays. And maps are declared with this syntax up here, where we have brackets for the key, and then the value, the type of the value right here. So this is a map of players to ints, or in our case, a map of players to weapon tiers. Now, this is at the top of the file outside of the main body because we're actually doing something kind of interesting here. So this is a type alias. If you declare a type up here at the top of your file, for instance, player_map, this tells your code that, hey, in the future, if you see me write the words player map, that means I'm actually writing player_int. So now, whenever I write player map, the code knows that I'm trying to declare a map of type player to int. So it's just a handy little shortcut in case you might have a very complicated name that you want to make easier to read or easier to understand for people. So we have a map of players to weapon tiers. But right now, if we did it like this, every player would be in the same map, which might get a little confusing when we're trying to compare players to other players on their team. Instead, we can actually put another map on top of this. We can nest these maps. I said before that maps are of any 2 types, and those types can be other maps. If we nest a map, we can have a map of type team to player to int, or in our case, a map that takes a team as its value and has an associated player map. We have a player map for each team. That inner player map takes a player as a value and gives you back their weapon tier. So now we have a map where all you have to do is pass into it a team, and you'll get back all the players on that team and all the weapon tiers for those players. And I declare that down here in this team map. I know it's a lot, it's a little confusing, but hopefully this syntax makes it a little easier to understand. This is where the type alias comes in. If you see, we have a map that takes a team as a key and has a player map as a value. Without the type alias, it looks like this, which is a little confusing. You have this key, and then you have this other key, and then you have the value. But this team map will keep track of all of our teams, all of our players, and all the weapon tiers for those players. So now we can very easily just, whenever a player scores an elimination, if we know what team they're on, we can get all the players on that team, and compare them against. So we talked a lot about maps, but let's get back to talking about the logic of what we're actually trying to do, which is grant a player a weapon when they score an elimination.
As you're going through this next session, we've gotten a question around how you can tie verse code to existing created devices. So if you could just highlight that explicitly in this section, because I know we're going to be using some devices here. So just like highlighting how that works.
So with existing created devices like the player spawner, Capen covered previously that if you look at their if you look at the API, you can see what events and what functions are available to be called from those existing devices. For instance, this player spawner has a spawned event in its API. And if you go and look at that, in fact, we can jump over right now. If we look at the spawned event, my bad, sorry, player spawner, or we can just look at the item placer device. So here are some functions that you can access from Verse for this random item placer device. It's got disable, enable, and get transform. This applies to any device. You can go and look it up in the API and see the list of functions and events that you can subscribe to and listen to. Hopefully that.
So basically, everything we're doing right now when we're in Verse, if we go back to that,
yes,
is like we're using Verse to interact with devices that we've placed in the game already. And we're using these API functions to actually reference and change things about those devices.
That's correct. This spawn event corresponds to all these player spawners here.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, Capen already covered the Fort character API, and that's what we're going to make use of here. To actually know when a player scores an elimination, we have to subscribe to that character's eliminated event. And I'm just going to uncomment that line right here. So a Fort character has an eliminated event we can subscribe to. We're going to subscribe this to a function on player eliminated, which we'll define in a moment. Like I said before, if you mouse over these subscribable events, you can see what type they return. In this case, this returns an elimination result, which is probably something you haven't seen before. It's a struct, which means it's just a container that contains multiple types of data. In this case, it has a eliminating player and an eliminated player. So the player doing the eliminating and the player, doing the elimination.
So the struct just holds that data so that we can reference it later.
That's correct. We're going to go ahead and uncomment our onPlayer eliminate function. Like I said before, this has an elimination result, or it takes an elimination result. And all we're doing here is we're extracting the eliminator, aka the character doing the eliminating. And we're also checking that that eliminator is a valid Fort character. If you think about it, a character doesn't have to be eliminated by other players necessarily. They could be eliminated by gravity, fire, wildlife, anything else in the environment. And so all we're doing in this function is just making sure a valid Fort character is the one doing the eliminating, and then we're getting the agent for that character. And then we're calling this function give next.
In that eliminator equals like elimination result dot eliminating character, that's pulling that eliminating character data from the struct, right?
Correct.
Great. I know I'm just repeating everything you've said, but I'm trying to make sure that we're all following along well.
Oh, I know.
Great way to learn.
It's a lot, but hopefully we're making it easy and digestible for everyone. And that's what we really hope to get across with all of our tutorials, making something that might seem super duper intimidating at the start easy to approach and easy to follow along with.
Yeah, the good news is that this is all a part of the documentation. So if you're really interested in doing this exact thing, you can sit here and listen, and then afterwards go to that documentation and follow at your own pace, step by step.
Yep.
All right, this is the big one. This is our give next weapon function. Again, just to reiterate, what this function needs to do is whenever a player scores an elimination, you need to promote either yourself if you're at a equal or lower weapon tier than everyone else on your team, or promote a teammate if you're at a higher weapon tier than anyone else. So I'm going to comment this. It's a lot, but we're going to go through it line by line. So give next weapon, just as a reminder, is being called by on player eliminated, which is passing in the agent doing the eliminating. All right. And we'll be referring to that as the eliminating player, line by line. So first we're setting up our weapon tier, which is the tier of the weapon that we're going to grant this player. We're going to set up a optional agent. Options are again declared with this question mark syntax, which is going to hold the player we're going to grant a weapon to. The
Wait,
reason
what's
this
an
has
agent?
an agent is a super type of player, which means that anytime you have a player, you could also use an agent instead.
Great.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's good. I'm just gonna keep asking little questions if there's new words
Oh,
that
you're
might
fine.
be interesting or odd.
I appreciate it. All right. So the reason this has to be an agent, by the way, is because if you have a reference to, the reason it has to be an option is that if you have a reference to an agent, you cannot change that reference unless it's within an option. So I can't have a blank agent that I assign eliminating player to, and then maybe later I'm going to assign a different agent to that. They have to be contained within this option. This is just for type safety. And then I'm
Okay,
also
it's
going
for
to
type
have,
safety and immunity. Got it.
yes.
Yeah, you can
And
kind of think about it as it allowing something to be null that you wouldn't normally allow. You know, verse doesn't have null, but we have option, which means that something is either the type that we say it is, which is what's after the question mark, or it's false, which means that hey, something might be here, but it also might not be, and you need to know that so you know how to deal with it if it's false.
Okay.
Because earlier when we were going through that struct, we could be pulling back that they weren't eliminated by a player, so we're protecting ourselves by making this like this right now.
that's right.
Great.
All right. So here's where the main body of the code happens, which is this loop that, again, just finds the player we're going to grant a weapon to. So in our variable context, our if statement, we're going to get the player team, the team of the player doing the eliminating, from that player team option. We're going to set weapon tier equal to the current weapon tier of that player. For accessing values from maps, it's done with this syntax of you have the name of the map, brackets, and then the key that you want to pass to that map. This is a nested map, so the syntax looks a little weird. I would say normally it looks like this, but since this is nested, we have to provide one more key. But you can think of it as, here's the team map. We give it the player team as a key. We're going to get back a player map as a value. To that player map, we're going to be providing the eliminating player as a key, and then we're going to get back the weapon tier as a value. So this whole thing will evaluate to a weapon tier, and that's what we're going to set this weapon tier variable to. Now, for every teammate, we need to iterate through and see if they're at a lower weapon tier. There's some neat syntax here that you might have seen before with arrays, where you can get the value in an array and also the index at the same time with this little arrow. It works the same with maps, actually. So this team map, player team, this whole thing evaluates to a player map, again, which is a map of players to weapon tiers. And we can get both the player and the weapon tier at the same time by using this little arrow. So now we have both, a reference to both. And we can compare that teammate tier to our current weapon tier. If that weapon tier is lower, it means this is the player we need to promote instead. If so, we're going to set weapon tier to the value of that teammate's weapon tier and set them as the player we're going to grant a weapon to by surrounding them with an option. All that done, all we're going to do is increment weapon tier by 1 because we have to grant the players the next weapon in the cycle. And then we are going to set that player to the new weapon tier in the team map. Again, just getting their team by accessing the option with this question mark, casting them to a player, because even though we're working with agents right now, our map is of type player to int. And then we're setting their value in the team map to weapon tier. Finally, if they've reached the number of eliminations required to end the game, we're just going to call end game on the end game device. The end game function just activates the end game device with the eliminating player. And finally, we're going to call grant weapon by passing in the player and then the weapon tier. I know that was a whole lot. So we're going to save this and we're going to jump in game to show you that this actually works again. So back in UEFN, we're going to hit verse, load verse code, and then push our changes.
While we're waiting for this to load, how are you defining the weapon tier?
So the weapon tier is the weapon that the player is currently at. The reason we're saying weapon tier is because weapon tier is a int, which corresponds with the index in the weapon granters array. So if they're at 0, they're at the first weapon. If they're at 1, they're at the second weapon,
Okay.
and so on and so forth.
And somewhere in verse, we've defined which weapons are 1, 2, 3, and 4, right?
Mhm.
I think that's what Josh was asking, is like, where,
Yeah.
like, we
Yeah,
call this
you would
weapon
Where are we
actually
tier
pulling the weapons
array,
from?
but where are we setting that array to values?
I got you. So up at the top, we have this editable array of weapon granters.
Okay. And that's all those.
Indices in our weapon granters, we have to set those in our verse author device in the level. So right here, we have our weapon granters array. If I hit plus, I can add another array element. And then I can assign each array element to one of our item granters at the level. Now I've named them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, just for me to know which one goes where. But what they are in verse is set by you right here in the level. It's the same with the player
Okay.
spawners. So
You
the
made
player
a verse
spawner
device.
yes.
You made a verse device, and then you're connecting the item granters, which have weapons in them, and you're assigning them in the verse device.
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay, so can we just go back to verse for 1 second before you show this?
Sure.
So this at editable notation, that means that it's going to then show up in editor on the side, right? That's how we were able to then set the weapon granters over in the editor.
Yes, any variable that
Great.
you add the at editable tag to will show up in in UEFN on the side. If I add the at
Okay.
editable tag to Teams, I would then be able to see it in the sidebar.
That wouldn't be useful right now,
Okay.
but totally awesome.
No,
Okay, cool.
not at all.
So
But you
All
could do
right.
it.
So
to derail us even more, another question in the chat's related. Is there a way to create a custom on eliminated event that could be exposed in the verse device? So you do this using that editable.
I am
So
not completely sure, is my answer.
Okay.
yeah,
I
you
know
can
there's a
define
device that does it itself, but
right. So
Yes.
you can write code to say what happens when that event is signaled. I don't believe you can make brand new events for devices right now. You can make events, but you can't do it for already existing devices. Those are already defined. So you just have to write code
okay.
that responds to the events that are already available on the device.
right, we
Okay.
don't allow you to
So
override those at this time.
yeah, so your answer would be probably leveraging the elimination manager and using those events.
Yeah, see what events are available and decide on what code you can write to respond to those events.
Awesome. Hopefully that answers your question, KBFN.
All right. So I'm feeling like I understand now. And we were able to see visually in the editor how you're doing things. So you can go back and like show us that this works now.
Alrighty.
And chat seems to be following along now too. So we're all good.
All
Perfect.
right. So back in game, if I score an elimination on poor hapless Cape in here, I get promoted to the next weapon, which is great.
Sweet.
And whenever player respawns, whenever my production account respawns, actually, over
Yeah, that
here,
wasn't me. I'm on your
There
team.
he is.
if I score
I get a
another
new weapon.
elimination, I promote Capen. And it just
Ah,
continually follows that rule of if I'm at equal or lower weapon tier, I promote myself. And if not, I'll promote Capen.
awesome.
Thank you, Evan.
Well, you're very welcome. So this is all well and good, but you don't always have people like Capen here to help you out. And you also probably don't have a production account sitting here to act as a target dummy. So if you're in a single player environment, how are you supposed to test this? Like, we made this whole code for game mode that's really reliant on these elimination events, but how are you going to do that by yourself? So actually, I want to take this time to highlight the Sentry device. So back in Visual Studio Code, actually back in UEFN, these two Sentry devices I alluded to earlier that we have set up in Visual Studio Code also have an eliminated event that you can subscribe to. So if you score an elimination event on the Sentry, it returns the same kind of elimination result. And you can listen to that and then use that to call give next weapon. So you can test eliminations in a single player environment, at least for games that are reliant on eliminations, without having to have everyone else jump in your game and help you for hours. So we are going to uncomment and define that now. And the same deal as before with the player spawners. In a loop, we're going to subscribe each Sentry's eliminate event to this test player eliminated function all the way down here. And all that's doing is just checking if there is a agent contained in this agent option, because in the same way, sentries might be eliminated by things that aren't agents, and then just calling give next weapon on them. So if we save this now,
Wait,
same
you
deal
mean
as
you're gonna
before.
make them more powerful as we go? Oh, man.
Yes.
That's actually another reason. Correct me if I'm wrong, Evan. That's why you have agent is because sentries qualify as agents, right? Because players can be
That's correct.
agents. The
Ah, okay,
sentries
that
are
makes so
also
much more
considered
sense.
agents.
Got it.
What
Cool.
about the guard spawner device? I see that mentioned in the chat. Do you know if they'd be able to use
As
that one
far as I'm
too?
aware, the Godspire device also has guards also have eliminated events.
Cool,
Awesome.
because 'cause they're also agents then?
That's correct.
We'll wanna triple check that, but we think so.
Yeah.
So same deal as before. You can build verse code, push the changes, save it, jump into our game, and then when we spawn, it's actually perfect because I'm on a team by myself. And now, with this sentry, I can eliminate it and promote myself to the next weapon, following the exact same rules as before. So that's basically how you can test eliminations in a single player environment. And
That's awesome.
like was said, we have to triple check, but you should be able to do the same for guards. So yeah, that's mainly it. That corresponded with step 7 of the tutorial. If you want to check out the full script, you can jump to step 8, final result, and just copy paste it into your level. As long as you have your devices set up, you can just do that immediately. Or if you want to follow along, you can actually run through the tutorial yourself. And that was just one of our many very cool tutorials that cover different language features in Verse. We have a few more under the build a game section if you're interested in checking them out. For instance, time trial pizza pursuit, tried infiltration, which came out just recently, parkour elimination race, and all the things covered by Capen previously.
Do you
And
know,
that's really it for me.
when we're here in documentation, do you know if we can see what things qualify as agents? Can we search around for that right now?
Sure, we can try and look that up.
Probably that agent class, right?
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I don't know
Hmm.
that you can see directly what things qualify. I think if you look into, you know, the spawner devices for what you're thinking of, you can kind of get an idea.
Mm.
To answer the
Okay.
question for someone in chat, here is the eliminated event for your guard spawners, and also the eliminating event if a guard scores an elimination.
Cool. And
Ah.
can
And this
we,
returns an agent.
but with a guard, can we assign? There was a question about guards not being able to be assigned a weapon. Is that true? Is that what we used for
I
the sentry?
am not personally aware of being able to assign guards a weapon like that. I know
Okay,
that
Yeah.
cool.
in UEFN you can give them their own weapon through what's exposed in the editor. I don't know about, say, giving a guard like an anvil rocket launcher or, you know, Infinity Blade is
Yeah.
something
There's
else.
only certain weapons they can use, and I don't know if you can change that mid-game.
Hmm.
Cool. And it doesn't look like that's something here in this API. So that's how you can kind of figure that out if you're wondering what you can do with a specific device. Is you can always come here, look at all of the things. Obviously, there's going to be some things that are editable in editor, but anything that's editable via API is all going to be displayed here. Hopefully, that helps like the 4 different questions that were sort of related to that.
And like Capen said before, we're always adding new cool things, so check back frequently, see what cool things we're letting people play with. So, yeah.
And to
Awesome.
answer one of the questions, we do have documentation on this whole elimination game mode that we just showed off. So we can get the link dropped in the chat for that. It is called Team Elimination Game on the EDC. 8 different steps. Go try it out.
Awesome.
All right. Any other questions from that? Drop them in chat.
I'm loving seeing over on the Twitch chat, people are pretending that a guard is rocket riding with a missile launcher, and I'm here for that. That sounds hilarious. Thank you,
Using
Flack, for
using
putting that in the
guards
chat.
using guards to test while you're solo will be really useful. I can never get anyone in to test with me, so save me a lot of
And then
time.
throughout this whole stream, we've gotten a couple of questions about if this is going to be available afterwards. Yes, all of our live streams are always available on demand after the fact, both on Twitch and on YouTube. So please check them out. After this live stream, we'll actually have a brand new playlist over on YouTube with all of the live streams that we've had so far. So that'll be a great place and resource for anyone who wants to check out everything, including last month's stream, which was also around some of our documentation. So really just like a lot of great ways to get started with using UAFN.
All right. Not seeing any more questions in the chat. Oh, hmm,
We are not answering anything forward looking, but I will write that down, Galactic
yes.
Death.
Okay. Well, if that's all we have for verse and verse questions, we can move on to our community highlights and discussions. So, Heather, you want to take us from there?
All right. I have things to say. Now, I just wanted to bring everyone's attention to the brand new Unreal Challenge, which is Furious Elegance this month. And we're really excited because anyone working in UEFN can also submit to this challenge. So definitely go take a look at the most recent blog announcement. It's all about animation. And I think there was a live stream, what, last week, Josh? On the Inside
Two
Unreal
weeks ago
channel
now, I think.
2 weeks ago.
Maybe
So you
last
can
week.
go check that out as well and dive into more understanding of what that challenge really means. But would love to encourage everyone here, if you're into animation, go check that out and give it a shot. Um,
Yeah. I
Otherwise,
will I'll add on that UEFN submissions are in their own category, so don't feel scared like you're competing against like master UE animation. Um, all the UEFN submissions will just be competing against UEFN submissions. So uh, if you love sequencer and control rig and are able to cook up some really cool stuff, I urge you to do that and submit. Um, we can link to that blog announcement and you can see all the rules and everything there.
Yeah. Other things happening in the community, as always, please make sure you go and check out the Epic Developer community, which has our forums and documentation. I know we've spent a lot of time there today, but it's always worth shouting out again because not only is there all of that brilliant documentation that Capen and Evan showed us, but there's also forums where you can ask all of the questions you've been asking and more and get answers from peers as well as Epic employees. We check them out pretty regularly. We're all in there. I know I read the forums every single morning. So definitely a place to go and chat, as well as our Discord. So if you want some more real time chat and you just want to talk about things that are happening, or again asking for some light advice from your peers, go and join our Discord. I know our wonderful stream managers quickly putting those links in the chat, so look for those. And then one other thing, just recently on the Fortnite channels, we started highlighting your islands every single week. And so I wanted to quickly just show last week's Island of the Week video, if we could play that.
Awesome.
So keep making cool things, and your island might get a shout out there or maybe on our other social channels. We are absolutely loving seeing all of the things you're making in UEFN and in creative, and can't wait to see what you come up with next because I know we all have fun jumping in and playing as well. Um, and that's all I have. Josh, do you have anything else for our last closing moments?
No, that's all I've got. I love all those games in that showcase, by the way. I play them all the time. You guys are so talented. I love seeing everything new coming out with UEFN. So just keep creating awesome stuff, posting it on Twitter, on the forums, tagging us, everything. I love to see it.
Yeah. Well, thank
Uh,
you, Capen and Evan, for joining us today,
Thank you.
getting all of this overview and deep dive into Verse and actually walking through a tutorial is so fulfilling. And hopefully, we helped break down some of those barriers of random words that didn't mean anything to some people beforehand, and now they may mean something, like agent. I know I learned that one today. So, really awesome to have you both, and we're really grateful for your partnership. And also, thank you to everyone in chat. You all have been blowing up the chat and following along and asking really like great questions. For those questions that we couldn't get answers to, we did write them down. So we'll try to track those down for you. And just really appreciate everyone being here today.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah,
for having us. This has
seriously.
been great.
Yeah, really happy to be here.
I learned a
All
lot.
right.
I think chat learned a lot. So thank you guys so much.
Great.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll
All
see
right.
you next month for the next Creating in Fortnite stream. Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.